Okay, we're talking about shims and different adapters that allow us to properly install shafts into many of the club heads, many of the OEM designs where we have specific adapters for Callaway, TaylorMade, Ping, Nike, for example. Also adapters that we have that allow us to install the 335 shaft into a 350 hosel bore. These are kits that we have that you can see in the Golfworks catalog or at golfworks.com, and a listing of all the different ferrules and adapters and shims that we have that we're going to show you through some segments of this video that can be used to properly do all these installation procedures. When we're talking about adapters to install, whether we're installing a 350 shaft into a 350 hosel bore and using that adapter, or whether we're installing a 335 shaft into a 354 and using this adapter, a very good rule of thumb is once your epoxy is mixed and you're doing your installation procedures, it's best to put some epoxy in the hosel, then install the adapter into the club head, and then lightly coat the inside of the adapter, coat the outside of the shaft, and then install the shaft through the adapter. You'll find that these will go together a whole lot easier if you do it that way, as opposed to first putting the adapter on the shaft and then trying to set it into the club head. Alright, now to explain the adapter that we have for Callaway and TaylorMade and Ping is an adapter that will allow you to change face angle. Now this is going to be an adapter that can only be used in the Callaway heads that require a 350 tip shaft, but you will be installing a 335 shaft tip diameter. And when you're installing these, it's best to have a golf club gauge so that you can set the club in the gauge and properly orient the face angle or lie that you're trying to create. For older TaylorMades, back when TaylorMade was doing the bubble shaft, they were doing some shaft tip diameters that were 395 to 400. And if you wanted to install a 335 shaft into that adapter, you could use the adapter that we have for Callaway and TaylorMade and Ping is an adapter that will allow you to change face angle. Now this is going to be an adapter that can only be used in the Callaway heads that require a 350 tip shaft, but you will be installing a 335 shaft tip diameter. And when you're installing these, it's best to have a golf club gauge so that you can set the club in the gauge and properly orient the face angle or lie that you're trying to create. For older TaylorMades, back when TaylorMade was doing the bubble shaft, they were doing some shaft tip diameters that were 395 to 400. And if you wanted to install a 335 shaft into that adapter, you could use this SADW, which had a sleeve and a ferrule all in one, sized outside diameter for a 400 hosel bore that would slide down into the shaft and then the shaft down through the inside of the adapter. There was also one, an SADI, that was used for some irons that required a 400 tip diameter shaft or 395, and these would allow you to install a 370 parallel tip shaft. It's always best when using these adapters to slightly sand down the outside diameter. Epoxy does bond to a clean abraded surface. If you get into some of the older Callaway models, such as an old Steelhead Plus here, this was a 350 tip diameter shaft, and if I wanted to put in a 350 tip diameter shaft, then I would use the stock Callaway ferrule for that. That was the short top with the slight little bit of a sleeve that extends down into the head. But if I wanted to install a 335 shaft, then an adapter like this that again had a short kind of a rounded off ferrule look to it, you would install that into the club head, and then you could install your 335 shaft down through that. And again, always best to slightly abrade the outside diameter, and also a good idea to take maybe a wire brush and run it down through the inside, again to abrade that a little bit, because again, epoxy bonds to a clean abraded surface. And slide it in carefully, maybe put a little pressure on it to slide it down in. Okay, next I'm going to put some epoxy down inside the adapter. Then a little epoxy on the tip of the shaft. A Steelhead Plus, which did require a 350 tip diameter shaft, and we're going to install a 335 shaft using this adapter that will The sleeve will take this from a 350 down to a 335. It has a built-in ferrule, which will also finish off at the top and be very similar to what Callaway would have initially used. First, I'm going to put some epoxy into the club head, and then I like to take the adapter and slide it in carefully, maybe put a little pressure on it to slide it down in. Okay, next I'm going to put some epoxy down inside the adapter, then a little epoxy on the tip of the shaft, and carefully slide that through, working the shaft slightly in and out, rotating it to get good coverage, getting it in a bore through properly through the bottom into the right position. I'm just using some newspaper to do some additional cleanup of this excess epoxy and to make so I can see that I got it through there correctly. Also clean up around the top of the ferrule. Once I've got most of that initial epoxy wiped up, I will then use a paper towel. But first of all, I have to install my bore-through pin into this bore-through, so I'm going to put some epoxy on the pin as well. Work that down in. If you don't do that, it can break off. I like to take a hammer, just tap and set that, and then finally just come along and clean up any excess epoxy. When I get it cleaned up well enough, I'll take some solvent on a paper towel to get any excess residue. And it's generally best to let this club dry in a position by laying it down on a rack this way to keep all your silk screens on your shaft aligned where you want to have them. We want to explain the use of the brass shims that we have for shimming. For example, in the case or the example that I'm going to do here, shimming a 335 tip diameter shaft into a 350 hosel bore. We also have shims that are 30 thousandths in size. For example, shimming a 370 shaft into a 400, which would be the case of some of the older TaylorMade products where they used 400 tip diameter iron shafts, and you could shim a 370 shaft using the shim 30. Also a shim 65, which would allow you to shim a 335 shaft into, again, one of those older TaylorMade 400 hosel bore sizes. There were some other companies that did some larger bore sizes as well. We do make these different shims available for doing this. In the example that I'm going to do, I'm going to show you how to use a shim 15 installing a 335 shaft into a 350 hosel bore. So I'm going to move these out of the way for a moment and have my shaft, and I'm going to start by putting a little, I always like to start by putting a little light coating of epoxy on my shaft, installing my ferrule onto the shaft. And if you do use a little epoxy, a lot of times that epoxy will let you help get this ferrule on a little easier, even maybe without an installation tool. Okay, make sure it doesn't go on too deep. If it does, you might want to pull it back up just a little bit, and again, the epoxy would allow you to do that in this case. Now, when I use the brass shim, I like to take and initially put some epoxy. Once I've got the ferrule on the shaft, put a light coating of epoxy into the club head, and then I actually take the shim and just set it into the club, kind of set it in there carefully. Take some epoxy on the tip of the shaft, just roll it in some, and then push this down in. Let the shaft push and set the sleeve. May have to pull it back just a little. And once that's in there, I don't want to pull that shaft all the way back out of the bore, because if you do that, 9 times out of 10 you're not going to get the shaft to go back inside the fingers of the adapter or of the shim. So just work it in and out, rotate it a little bit to see that you're getting adequate coverage, and then take, in my case I just use some newspaper to do an initial cleanup and get anything cleaned off that you can, and then take a paper towel, some grip solvent, and clean up any excess residue of shafting epoxy. Line your graphics on your shaft, whether you're putting the silk screen on top or bottom, or spinal lining or piering the shaft, so that you get all your marks set up properly, and then simply set your club up in a plain position to dry.